Welcome to the Mind and Crip Theology podcast, hosted by Miriam, Spies, and Amy Panton, which come out of the Canadian Journal of Theology, Mental Health, and Disability.
We both live and work on lands that have been homes and remain homes to the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Neutral, and the Ojibwe Chippewa peoples and other peoples who have cared for the land.
We are grateful for the opportunity to live and work on this land and are mindful of the need to repair broken covenants.
This podcast is an opportunity to model how faith communities can engage in theological and spiritual conversations around madness and cripness.
If you need a full transcript, you can find our videos on our YouTube channel.
We want to say before we begin that topics and conversations we are raising throughout our time together are often hard.
They are hard for mad and crip people ourselves, and hard for our families and loved ones.
So do what you need to do to take care of yourselves, your bodies, minds, and hearts.
And now, here is our episode. So, welcome to this episode of the Mad and Crip Theology podcast. Today, we're delighted to be joined by MacGregor once again, and Robbie Walker will be joining at some point during this episode. So we thought today we would talk about someone who has said something that has shaped or encouraged our theological work, either from theology or from outside the discipline. Just to lift up good theology and sources people may have heard before or may want to look into again. Amy, have I covered everything?
Yeah, I was thinking too when you were talking, like, I don't know how other people feel, but like I feel like sort of as a person who's in the academic world, we spend so much time critiquing other people in the field.
Yeah.
We're always looking for problems or things to argue about, basically, civilly, politely. But today, I think being able to honor some people who've gone before us is really something that we're delighted to do. And the other thing I might just put out there, like as we're getting started, I was thinking about this. You know that subreddit that's called Shower Thoughts. I was having shower thoughts this morning as I was getting ready to go out, and I was thinking while I was in the shower that there can be a bit of a I pick it up here and there in some of the things I read, a bit of a romanticization of some people, either with disabilities or with mental health stuff going on. And I hope that we will be able to find the right tone today. I don't want us to be romanticizing other people's suffering or, I don't know. I find sometimes when people, well, I mean, it will happen to us too. You know, when people think back on our lives after we are gone, they're going to think about certain things about us and exclude other things. But I find, especially for the person that I'm going to be talking about, Anton Boysen, there can be a bit of like a romanticization of his suffering. when I hear some people write about what he's gone through. So I hope that I don't do that today when I'm talking about him, and I'm able to give like a full picture, or like honor some of that suffering as well. Like talk about the bad stuff too, is what I'm trying to say, not only the good stuff. So yeah, hopefully that makes sense. Everybody's nodding.
Yes, of course it makes sense.
For those who are listening, everybody's nodding. Is it who wants to start us off?
Maybe Laura, you can.
We'll volunteer you, Laura.
Thanks. Put me on the spot. Sure. Would you like me to read the quote first and then talk a little bit about why I chose it? Great.
Sure.
So I chose a quote. It was a bit of a debate about what to choose, thinking through some of the writers who have most influenced my academic and theological formation. And I waffled between John Swinton and Arthur Frank. And Arthur Frank, for those who don't know, wrote The Wounded Storyteller, and he talks about illness narratives. And I became very interested in a chaos narrative because it seemed to capture my life, but that's not the quote I chose. Are you holding up The Wounded Storyteller, Miriam?
It's a good one.
Yeah, it's a good book. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. It's a very, very good book by Arthur Frank. Yeah, The Wounded.
My background is.
And then, so the book I ended up choosing, or the passage from the book I ended up choosing, was from Raging with Compassion, Pastoral Responses to the Problem of Evil by theologian John Swinton out of Edinburgh. And here's the passage that I decided I wanted to talk about. To tell a mother whose baby is dying of starvation that it is really for the good and that she will learn valuable lessons through the experience is to develop a theodicy that may be theoretically interesting, but that in practice is evil. What kind of God are we left with if we manage, through clever intellectual moves, to fit such obscene forms of cruelty and evil into a framework that somehow justifies it and draws it within the boundaries of the love and righteousness of God? When we try, we blame either the victim for making bad choices or God, and in doing so, reduce both God's love and God's power. Normally, the former, blaming the victim, is the safest and easiest options. So that's the quote I chose. And for those who may not know my story, which has been shared in other podcasts, I'm the mother of a child of 3 boys. I have 3 boys. I sometimes talk exclusively about one in these podcasts, but I have 3. And my middle son, Matthew, lived with very complex disabilities until his death at the age of 21. And I found, as his mother and as his caregiver, particularly I think because Matthew was very visibly disabled, that I often became the recipient of other people's stories. And other people would look at me and would look at Matthew, and they would slot us into a story they had pre-decided. And unfortunately, often those stories took on elements of theodicies. They took on elements of rationalizing God in the face of what they perceived as suffering of a child or a mother. And I received these theodicies both during Matthew's life and following his death. And for me, particularly in the early years of parenting Matthew, and trying to make sense of my own faith and faith journey, this became very challenging. I wasn't sure how to make sense of this God that people were telling me about, who would choose my child to be the recipient of significant challenges or suffering. And I appreciated Swinton's work in naming those theodicies as particular forms of evil, that these theodicies that made God this cruel agent who handed out difficult challenges to unsuspecting children and their mothers. I appreciated how he labeled that as troubling, as problematic, as evil, and ultimately a challenge to faith in a good and benevolent God. His work goes on to unpack that in far more depth. But in terms of my own theological formation and journey, both academically and personally, his work critiquing those theodicies was particularly helpful for me. So is that kind of what you wanted to hear in terms of a passage and why that passage has been meaningful to us? Great.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I wanted to ask you, Laura, have you been able to share some of Swinton's, like this particular passage or some thoughts that come out of this passage with other people who've gone through similar things to you? And what have they said? Do they agree? Do they disagree?
Yeah, I think both, to be really honest. So part of my research is talking to parents and often mothers who are caring for very complex children. And my MA work looked at mothers who were caring for very medically fragile children. And if I think through those mothers, out of the very small sample size I was working with, many ultimately would lose their children. Their children would die at very young ages. And many of them talked about how difficult it was to hear these stories, for lack of a better word, because that's how they would hear it, these explanations and justifications for God that allowed other people to sustain their faith, to keep it intact, not being sensitive to the fact that it might ultimately erode another person's faith. And we would talk about the fact that there are people who critique this and that name these explanations of God as particularly evil, as a form of a problematic theodicy unto themselves. That said, I've also talked with people who really value these theodicies, who really value belief in a God that will not give them more than they can handle, who has pre-decided a story well before time began, and they're living through their part of it. That for many people, for some people I've worked with, these stories have been really important. These theodicies allow them to sustain faith. And so I think that's a real challenge when, for those of us who maybe work in more the pastoral care, pastoral theology side of things, how do we address these and make sure that we understand where people's faith in God is? And I think the other thing is that if people are living through challenging times, their story and their faith with God is a constantly moving target sometimes, that they may believe one thing one day and come to believe something different later. And I know that after some of my research, I had to spend real time thinking about how do I make sense of these stories that come from different sides? So certainly I've talked about it with other mothers, and they have, if I had to sort of summarize, the majority would say they found the theodicies challenging, that they ultimately were hurtful and challenged their faith. However, there certainly were, I can think of a handful of parents over the years that found real comfort in that particular idea of God. So being sensitive to where people might be and what their faith looks like, I think is really important.
So I'm hoping that some clergy and some congregation members will hear these podcasts, and I wonder if you might share how would you like message we talk about in church? How would you like him to be known and to be seen, or and unseen in church these days.
So sorry, so how would I have liked Matthew and I to be seen in church rather than a source of inspirational narratives or theodicies?
And now following his death, how would you like to be cared for or to be? Right?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think sort of during Matthew's life, my main request would have been to not be the recipient of inspirational narratives, not be the source of inspiration. It's called inspiration porn for those who aren't familiar with the term. This idea of developing an inspirational story based on someone else's story that meets your need for inspiration, but may or may not be what's happening with the individual living it out.
And I think that goes with other people's theologies, why they push this happen because God is like this would help them maintain their who they believe God should be.
Right, yeah, these theodicies really worked for them, but didn't work for me. So, you know, what would I have wanted? I think really just, first of all, to listen to what my story was, rather than to tell me what my story was. That famous bell hook like Miriam. Yeah, to sort of stop and hear what is my experience, what is my story, because it's far more complicated than the story you've attached to me. And it's not all bad, but it's also not all good. It's complicated. And so I would have liked that. And I think that just applies to both during Matthew's lifetime and following his death. It's just, and I think it, you know, I summarized some of this was part of my MA work, and I summarized my MA work with a sentence, and I'll be blunt. I said, "Shut up and bring coffee." What would I have wanted? Shut up. So don't tell me my story. Listen to what my story might be. Be willing to hear my story. And don't offer your theology, make space for my theology, and bring coffee, be a friend, hang out with me, do typical everyday stuff. Don't turn everything into some sort of inspirational moment. Just be in the space with me and listen to me and have coffee with me. And that was sort of the summary of my MA work. And I think that's what I would say, you know, for people who are living through these complicated stories, shut up and bring coffee.
And awesome. What kind of coffee do you take?
I'll drink pretty much anything. I'm a huge drinker, and I like it with milk and no sugar.
Awesome.
Got it.
I see Robbie's here, so let's invite him into the conversation.
Hey, Robbie.
Hello.
There we go. Good to
Your camera's working today. Yay.
Yay. Yep. Figured it out.
Awesome.
Amy, do you want to share next?
Yeah, sure. So Robbie, Laura just shared some of her, what she liked from John Swinton's writing. So I'm gonna share now something that's helped me in my journey, and that is Anton Boysen's writing. So he died. He died in 1965, actually, and he was born in 1876 in Indiana. So he's an American, and he was hospitalized due to mental distress, and he was diagnosed with dementia praecox. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, which is now what we would consider to be schizophrenia. So he was going through some really dark times and his family thought, okay, like, you really need help. We need to figure out what's going on here. So they did have him hospitalized. And he's a really interesting person because he writes, it's so interesting. So he wrote a book based on his experience in the hospital, and he was in a couple of psychiatric hospitals in the Boston area. And his book, The Exploration of the Inner World, it's out of print, but you can get it here and there, like through libraries and stuff. It was published in 1936. And so it's such an interesting book because it's like his reflections on actually being a patient in the hospital and what shitty spiritual care he received while he was in there, which was basically like none. And the pastors that they would bring in would be giving, like, they would come in on like a Sunday and they would give sermons that were like totally inappropriate for a mental health environment where people were really struggling. Like, they would preach on like violent psalms or like portions of the Bible that were on like battles and stuff. And he would think like, oh, this is not good for people's mental health being in here. We need to like, we need to do better. So basically what happened was he was hospitalized many times throughout his life, but during the times when he was out of the hospital, he was able to start working with one of his colleagues. I can't remember which university it is, I'm so sorry, but basically him and this professor were able to start bringing theological students into the hospital, the same hospital that he had been staying in. And so basically he's known as sort of like the father of clinical pastoral education, which for most people who have an MDiv or MPS or anything, a lot of those degrees, professional degrees, you have to do units of clinical pastoral education in order to earn your degree. So it's because of him that exists. And I think he's interesting because he talks about, so on page 1 of Exploration of the Inner World, he says, to be plunged as a patient into a hospital for the insane may be a tragedy or it may be an opportunity. For me, it has been an opportunity. It has made me aware of certain relationships between two important fields of human experience, which thus far have been held strictly apart. And he's talking about psychiatry and theology there. And it has given me a task in which I find the meaning and purpose to my life. He also talks a little bit later in the book, and this is the quote I wanted to share with everyone today, about this idea of in the 1930s when he was hospitalized, we didn't have the kind of spiritual care departments that we have. Like, you couldn't really call the chaplain like you can now. So he provides a reflection on this in the book, and he says, it seems therefore not inaccurate to say that if a man has a broken leg, he can in almost any part of the country be cared for in a church hospital at church expense and under church auspices. But if he has a broken heart, he is sent to an institution, there to be forgotten by the church. And I think when I first read this quote, I thought, oh my goodness, I feel like such a affinity with this man who is so different than me and has lived so long before me, but also has really put his finger on something that has given me a lot of like direction in my own sort of research, and also my own way of thinking about how we can do work on madness and mental health from a theological point of view. And lastly, I'll just mention that actually 2 things real quick. So when he had the students come into the hospital to do work with the patients, they weren't allowed to, like, quote unquote, prod them or lecture them. Those are the 2 things they were not allowed to do. They were only allowed to listen. So they would go out with the patients for walks and sit with them and eat with them. And they weren't there to preach, so to speak. They were there just to be there with them on the journey, which I really like. And I'm so glad that we still have that model. The other thing that was sort of mind-blowing to me about Boysen's work is it was the first time I ever read about Jesus being mad. And this is something that I would like to say, some things in mental health or mad studies kind of like cycle. So I feel like Boysen kind of like touched on this about 100 years ago, and now it's coming back around and people are interested in it again. So he writes very bluntly that he believes that Jesus was experiencing hallucinations, and like, for instance, during his baptism, or when he was tempted by Satan in the wilderness, and also during the transfiguration. And he asks, like, was this psychosis? And so for Boysen, he thinks that having these experiences were very important for Jesus, because he was able to gain the insights he needed to be able to speak with authority about the meaning of his life. And so I remember I presented this theory to some of my students in a class I taught this summer, and I could see over Zoom their eyeballs exploding and their brains like are like all over the place, because they're like, what? I've never heard of this before. And a few of them maybe were a little, I don't think they were upset, but they were a little shaken by the idea. And so I had to say to them, you know, maybe this is controversial for some people to think this way, but it's an important part of the conversation. And this conversation about, like, you know, diagnosing people in the Bible, or, you know, thinking about people in the Bible through the lens of modern psychiatry is something that, like, in my opinion, has cycled back again. And we're at this stage again where we're rethinking about these things. For instance, like diagnosing God and diagnosing Jesus and other people from the Bible. And I think it's fascinating. Some other people might be like, I wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole, but I really think it's really interesting. So yeah, that was my Boysen talk.
I wonder what difference, like, why do you find it so fascinating? What difference does it make to think of Jesus as mad?
It's important to me because I feel like when I first read, there's a few articles that came out maybe 10 years ago that talk about giving God a diagnosis, like depression. There's another one with giving a bipolar 1 diagnosis, also narcissistic personality disorder. There's a few of these ones that are popping up. And then, you know, there's Jeff Hood's book, The Psychosis of God. And these different books I think are interesting because, like, it's comforting for me to know or believe or think that there's a part of God that understands some of my lived experience. And maybe God's lived experience is the same as mine. Yeah, and I think also if that is true, if part of God's experience, like let's say if Jesus was experiencing hallucinations or some kind of psychosis, that means that I think his heart is closer to some of the people that I've spent time with in my life than we might care to admit, because I think for me, at least, I've talked about this before on podcasts, previous podcasts, I grew up with a very powerful God and a very powerful Jesus. Like, they'll just like blow everything up, and like they're very strong and they never sleep and all this stuff. And thinking about a Jesus that needs to rest, maybe would have been on meds if he was around now. These things are really, like, I don't know, meaningful to me, very meaningful.
Thank you.
I
Robbie
see
and
some, yeah.
Noah, do you have questions for Amy?
I think you asked a bit of my question, I think, Miriam, but I think maybe, you know, some of the same question or part of the same question you asked, Miriam, and that is, you know, if you were to be speaking to people in congregation, so maybe outside of an academic context, where it's not an academic exercise, you know, what do you want people in the pews or in leadership positions in the church to understand about mental health and God and Jesus and that interrelationship, maybe?
I think I'm still trying to figure that out, honestly.
Okay. Fair.
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure that out. I think that for me, we were talking were we talking before the podcast about how, I don't want to like give away what Miriam's going to be talking about today, but some theology, some good disability theology, some good mental health theology, we don't encounter usually, like just like regular people going to church, coming home and stuff. For some reason, some of that theology, in my opinion, some of the best theology that I've ever encountered is like, it's not hidden, but it's like saved for some reason for seminary, and I don't know why. Like, I think some of this stuff is like important, and there's a lot of truth in it, at least from my point of view. I think if we could talk about a God who has vulnerabilities and also shares in some of our, well, we talk about God sharing in our suffering. I don't know why there's like, it seems to me that there's certain kind of suffering that's like okay, and certain kind of suffering like we still try to hide, or we're like, maybe we're ashamed to think of God as sharing in that. I don't really know. I haven't figured that out. Or maybe there's like suffering that's oh my God, what's the word? I can't think of the word right now, but suffering that you're okay with people seeing, and some suffering that you don't want people to see. Anyway, yeah, I hope that some of the work that I'm trying to do through my teaching will be able to help students think about new ways of imaging God. You know, there's a talk a lot about in the sort of therapy end of what some of the teaching and TAing that I'm doing at Emmanuel College about people's God images, right? So what kind of God image do you have based on like Anna Maria Risotto's work? What kind of God image do you have, and can some of that image be changed, or is it forever burned into our brains? I hope it can be changed, and I hope some of these conversations will open up the dialogue so that we can start to think about God in new ways. Hopefully that made sense.
Yes, thank you.
I have a question, if you don't mind, because mad studies isn't my field. I wonder sometimes if there's a difference between living with mental illness and being mad. Because Jesus didn't have a typical experience of reality, and but he might have been perceiving correctly. Do you know what I mean? And so if somebody says, or you know, there's a whole strand of social science from the 1950s, for example, that when they speak about, you know, Pentecostals speaking in tongues, it's a form of psychosis.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And so, you know, and you know, these people, what do you mean miracles? And what do you mean, you know, casting out demons? And so I just but now there are lots of strands where it's like, well, let's see whether this is socially useful. What is this for? What is it doing? And maybe they just have a different framework for interpreting reality. And so because I'm still somewhat at home in that world, Minnesota multiphasic personality inventory, I have never had a vision, true, false, right? And so I said to the woman who was sitting there, invigilating my exam, so to speak, it was fun, but I said, like, what does this mean? She says, you need to interpret. So I had to say false, because I have. I don't think I was diagnosable with something. I don't think my experience of having visions was quite probably what the authors of the Minnesota multiphasic meant. And yet I had to speak truthfully inside my own worldview. So I'm quite sure that people who were like, Jesus has gone mad, he casts out demons by Beelzebul, right? So there's this idea of, we can't compute your experience of reality, which may be different than Jesus is diagnosable with something, perhaps. So, so I'm okay with Jesus being mad. I'm not sure that I'm personally comfortable with Jesus's living with a malfunction diagnosable as, in some sort of biopsychosocial fashion. For myself, I don't think I'm comfortable with that. But what do I know? He'll figure it out.
Yeah, for sure. I hear what you're saying, Robbie, and I think it also depends on what you mean when you say mad. And for me, it definitely, I wouldn't think, I'm not saying that I think there's something quote unquote wrong with Jesus, or quote unquote Jesus needs therapy, or like Jesus needs to be fixed by going on meds. That's not what I mean. I mean that like he has some kind of lived experience that, like you said, is not perhaps what other people might deem to be quote unquote normal. And we all know the normal stuff that comes along with disability studies and MAD studies. So yeah, it's a very like it's an interesting conversation. And if anyone's interested in reading something that just came out on this topic, you might want to pick up the new book, The Bible and Mental Health. It's called The Bible and Mental Health, Towards a Biblical Theology of Mental Health. And there's a really interesting chapter called Jesus and Madness in the book by Joanna Collicutt. And so she goes through the whole shebang on madness in the Greek and how it's in the text, and where different parts of the Bible where people call Jesus mad, and talks about it. So it's not like made up, like it's actually in the Bible. For those people that are like, it's in the Bible, it's in the Bible. And so she's talking about like, what does this mean when we encounter this word? So yeah, it's very interesting. Cool. Robbie, would you like to share yours next?
Sure. I don't have a quote, unfortunately, because I think the book is in storage in Guelph, Ontario. However, I can tell you, I'm sitting in, Cabbagetown, Toronto, and it's, in a basement in Guelph. But the book is called Spirit and the Politics of Disablement by Sharon V. Betcher. And one of the reasons that it really impacted me was it was the first time that I encountered a theology that sort of crystallized for me what I was starting to think about. I'm such a bad capitalist, and being okay with it, being okay with being able to, because I'm deemed, disabled and visibly disabled, and it's not your fault, and so in some ways I get to leverage that in ways that allow me to be parallel to normal processes and sort of sit there and go, huh, this is kind of unhealthy. The way that, the 9-to-5 rat race and how cruel academic processes are, for students, and all of these things. And so that was tremendously useful. And then the part that has shaped part of what I do is she's talking about, the colonial and liberal. She's like, colonial and liberal are flip sides of the same coin, folks. Let's be real about that. It seems to me that she's never seen a deed of power. She's never seen a miracle, because I'm a liberal Lutheran, and miraculous cures don't happen in my context. Therefore, something else must be going on in these texts. And I'm like, you're not wrong exactly, but what do you do with a deed of power if you've seen them, and that this is part of your conception of what the gospel does for people, or what the power of God is able to do in the visible world. So the part that I appreciated, though, was really honest passages of encountering Pentecostal Christians who were just not consent-based remotely, and being unintentionally abusive, if I can use that language, of visibly disabled people, be healed in the name of the Lord, and being hit across the knees with a newspaper when you're using a chair. Excuse me, what? Okay, but does that happen in Pentecostal context? You bet your bottom dollar it does, okay? And so if I'm sitting self-consciously, self-reflexively as a Pentecostal, disabled, queer scholar, or student scholar at this point, and someone who wants to be a pastor and care for souls in a responsible journey with, rather than I have all the power and I'm going to tell you how it is. If all of these things are part of who I want to be in the world, how do I hold, I believe in the miraculous ministry of Jesus, and I refuse to call on your experience, and a deeply consent-based model, even for doing charismatic or Pentecostal healing ministry. So all of these wheels started to turn in really serious ways when I encountered Sharon Betcher. So I really appreciate how crunchy her work has made my experience.
Thanks so much, Robbie. Does Laura or Mir, do you guys have any questions that you have for Robbie about what he said?
Yeah, lots of questions.
Thanks, Laura.
Every once in a while, I need key terms defined. Please define crunchy theology for me.
Oh, okay.
Because I need that term defined. That would be helpful for you.
Sure. When I say crunchy, it's like both delicious and uncomfortable. So, okay. So for me, it's, or when I say, oh, I'm feeling crunchy today, it's like all of these things that I feel as competitive are all arriving in the same moment, and I need to deal with them all at the same time. I'm feeling crunchy. Okay. Okay. So yeah, so crunchy. So her theology is crunchy because on the one hand, do I want to be the sort of person who will, in my theology of healing and my practice of healing, give people agency to resist capitalist bullshit? You absolutely, yes, please. And on the other hand, I feel obligated to resist. There's no such thing as a deed of power. And so, I reach her and I feel crunchy, but it's a productive level of anxiety or conflict. So that's what I mean by crunchy. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Robbie,
Granola.
I have a question for you. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your position on healing. I know this can be a difficult subject for people to talk about, and I hope you'll just share a little of what you're comfortable with. But as you're moving forward into your pastoral work for the future, is that something you want to be involved with in your pastoral work, or would you prefer not to go there? I just wonder.
I want to be available to go there. Yeah, the first time my Anglican bishop gave me an interview about, oh, you're interested in ordination. He said, so it seems very clear that you want to be a scholar, but why do you want to be a priest? And for some reason, this is what came out of my mouth. I said, I write academic papers so that I can lay hands on the sick in my parish. And he said, thank you very much. That's a very clear answer. And he himself had been part of the charismatic renewal in the 1970s in the Anglican tradition, and in his words, a fairly healthy rendition. So for me, if people ask, I'm going to do what I can. There will be certain things, there will be people, I'm sure, still in the contemporary Canadian context who come to me and say, I'm queer and I don't want to be, will you pray for me? And I would say, well, here's how I can pray for you. I can pray for the Spirit to be with you so that you can maximize your own integrity before God. And that's about as far down that particular trail as I can go. But if someone came to me and said, I have CP and I don't want CP, I live with spina bifida, I don't want to live with it anymore, I have colitis, I have diabetes, I have okay, there would be lots of things that I'd be like, yes, absolutely, let's go. But gently. And what I mean by gently is I have learned ways of doing things from people who understand on a gut level that shame is thoroughly corrosive. And I've certainly also experienced that. And so I have seen and want to model ways of, we will pray for you, we will fully support you regardless of what the outcome is of the prayers. We'll pray more than once because there's nothing wrong with that. And you, person being prayed for, will never be shamed by us for any reason, regardless of the outcome, because you as you are God's treasure. And you as you are have gifts to offer. And if healing is something that you desire because of your own integrity before God, then yes and amen. And if you are not on the same page as me theologically, yes and amen. Please do what is healthy for your own soul. but I take the miracle stories in the canonical gospels literally. I really actually think they happened, or stories that were very much like them. I think that people who were unsighted saw. I think that people who were unhearing heard. I think that paralyzed, and air quotes, crippled people were not paralyzed and crippled when Jesus was done encountering them. And I think that is, if it is desired, that is appropriate ministry for the church to offer in today's world. So that's where I am. But it has to smell like Jesus in order to be worth anything. And Jesus, in my reading of scripture, he always encountered people as though they were God's treasure. And so that's the way I want to be.
Yeah, it's interesting hearing you reflect on the healing narrative, because I think I come at healing with a great sense of suspicion and a great sense of healing in order to fit people into some norm that the general population can handle. So I always say that it has made me who I am. It has made me who I am in relationship to God, in relationship to family, friends, others, and that I wouldn't be me without City. So I wouldn't want it to be Kyoto. Any of that. Saying that, I've had time of depression, and I've had shitty times where I don't want to be writing a thesis on atheism, but that doesn't mean I want to be healed. So I think I appreciate hearing your thoughts on healing, but I think I come at it with more suspicion and think it's been co-opted by the norm in society, whatever that norm is at any given moment.
I agree with you, because I see these very normy. It's really interesting to me. I have a particular church network in my head, but I don't know whether I want to name them. Maybe I will, just to be a shit disturber. But like Bethel Church is based out of Redding, California, Pastor Bill Johnson. Okay, so his people, he teaches his people to pray for healing, and apparently they're quite successful. That's fine on a whole bunch of things. But the thing that I notice is that this is almost a mega church. They handle themselves well. They're not unethical in that sense, but it's a mega church setting. He looks very well coiffed, and he's got these fabulous glasses and, a very Pentecostal sense of humor. But, the first thing he does at the beginning of every sermon is he pulls out his iPad and tells a joke. Okay? And then the politics of Bethel Redding are horrific from my perspective. And so healing ministry, but the norm in his network is people are going to be visibly whole, not mentally ill. They don't have cancer. They're going to be fabulous anti-queer capitalists. That is the norm, right? So whatever healing ministry is occurring is immediately being co-opted. So I think I am suspicious on that level, and yet I think Jesus took the risk sometimes. If people came for healing, he healed them, and some of the people immediately ran and joined society as they knew it, with a sense of relief. And other people were like, I can't go home. Shit. Now what? And so I wonder, I'm curious about whether there are, I want to say, norms of what the Gospels call the kingdom of God that disrupt other norms. But does God have norms? Does God have desires? Does God have goals for creation that we can misalign with in various ways? So for me, just to finish very quickly, for me, if someone said, do you want to be healed of CP and you won't remember a fucking thing about having CP, I would say no, absolutely not. Okay. But if my memory is fully intact, yes, please, because I won't lose the experience that has made me me, in my opinion. So I think for me, it would depend on how much do I remember. Because if you're going to erase my memory, then no, that's not, to me, that's not healing, that's erasure, literally. And I think there's a difference. So yeah, but I hope you can hear some mutual appreciation, Miriam, of your perspective. So thanks.
Laura, would you like to make any comments about our healing conversation? You're sitting, you know, before, the way that your camera was angled, it looked like these beautiful rays of sunshine were like, you look like an angel, basically. For people who are just listening, she looked like an angel because these beautiful rays of sunshine were coming from behind your head, and it was very beautiful.
Thank you, but I mean, because I couldn't see anything. Yes. The reflections were getting really crazy, and all I could see was this blast of light. Wow, this is a fascinating conversation, and I was thinking as I'm listening to Miriam and Robbie talk about their respective experiences of living with cerebral palsy and their views on healing, I found myself thinking, well, you know, how do I feel? I also had a child who had cerebral palsy, among many diagnoses, but that was one of his diagnoses. And, you know, I always, and I think my answer is I need time to sit with this because I'm not sure where I land. And I can remember being in a church. We were not in a church. It was not our church. We were a guest in someone's church, and someone came over and said, you know, if you just pray hard enough, you know, God can make this better. God can take away what's going on with Matthew. And I wasn't sure how to respond to that, you know, and people would come up to us and say, I'm going to pray over you while I'm playing in the park with my children. It was all very bizarre at times. And I think my feeling has always been Matthew couldn't tell me what his feelings were on the subject. So I don't know how Matthew feels or felt about what he would have wanted, how cerebral palsy may or may not have been part of his identity. And ultimately, I feel that Matthew gets the final decision. And I don't know what that decision would be. And in whatever happens after this lifetime, I don't know what it looks like. So I don't know. As Matthew's mother, I would vehemently, assertively argue that my son was perfect and whole in his embodiment and ability. And I mean that physically and intellectually and spiritually. And therefore, as his mother, I would say that healing was not necessary because he was perfect. And he was perfect and he lived as God created him. Though, yeah, and it's interesting. I teach a class right now with ministers, and we've been talking about some of these subjects, and they've had some really, really helpful thoughts as well. And I really value this class because I feel like a charlatan. I don't feel like the instructor. I feel like I'm just learning alongside them because they have such fantastic ideas. And we've talked about some of these things, and they've been very helpful as well. So yeah, I'm not sure where I land other than Matthew was perfect. I do not see a need for him to be healed. That said, Matthew also suffered. He lived with significant pain at times. He had significant medical issues, and he did not have the verbal ability or intellectual ability to tell us what was happening. So his ability to influence dealing with that pain was complicated. We often didn't know what we were trying to deal with. I would have valued healing in those moments. I would have valued something that could make them better. And at times we could not make them better, and we didn't handle it well, we humans. And it would have been nice for God to swoop in and make it better. And that didn't happen. So it is hard to reconcile some of those ideas with healing narratives where God does swoop in and make things better in a story. Yeah, so I think that's my non-answer. It's something I think about, and I don't know if I have a really solid answer, but yeah, I believe that disability, intellectual disability, physical disability, mental health challenges, these are all part of God's perfect creation. And I would include sexuality and LGBTQ experiences. I am straight, so I do not understand those in the same way, but this is all part of God's perfect creation and diversity. And that's sort of where I land. And beyond that, I think I leave it to thinkers greater than me. But thanks for asking.
So I am aware of time, and we want to respect everyone's time today, and especially respect our listeners' time. So Miriam still has to share. So Miriam, I'm going to invite you to share your passage with us.
Sure. So many in the Disablement Theology Board knows Nancy's work. She's kind of like the mother of disability theology in some ways. She wrote a book. She wrote some books, edited some books, but her most famous one is called The Disabled God. She was born in 1964 and died in 2009. Life gone too soon for sure. And she was an American, but we won't hold that against her here in Canada. And her book is known for the experiences Jesus following his resurrection with the wounds of that crucifixion. But the passage that has challenged and shaped me the most is when she talked about her image of God. So I will read this quote from page 89. Like a faithful Jew who conscientiously opened the door for a larger each Seder. And upon images of the majestic beauty of the Messiah who would shout an order and the universe would tremble. I had waited for a mighty revelation of God, but my epiphany bore little resemblance to the God I was expecting, or the God of my dreams. I saw God in a sip puff wheelchair. That is the chair used mostly by quadriplegics, enabling them to maneuver by blowing and sucking on a jaw-like device. Not an omnipotent, self-sufficient God, but neither a pitiable, suffering servant. In this moment, I beheld God as survivor, unpitying and forthright. I recognized the incarnate Christ in the image of those judged, not feasible, unemployable, with questionable quality of life. He was God for me. And this thing is a very beautiful image, especially in our conversation around God's power and how might God be less powerful than we demand of them. So, and how does that view of God as a person in a wheelchair, as a Black woman, as a queer and drag, how does that change who we engage in relationship? And so she has that hip-hop wheelchair said, "Oh, okay, I'm part of God's image," like Amy was talking about before. And I think this ties into her work and my work. Her work on the Eucharist being a ritual of degradation for some people with disabilities, being denied the element of being denied the privilege of presiding. Because if we believe in a God who's born in our flesh, then God is born in many different experiences of that flesh, and therefore should be seen as holy and as beloved and as worthy of receiving elements or sending elements to others. we could go on and on. I could go on and on about Nancy and that image, but that was the one I wanted to bring to this conversation. And anyone have thoughts, questions, reflections?
This is my favorite Eastland quote as well, Miriam. We were talking before the podcast started, and I think I've shared before. I can't remember if it was on this podcast, but I felt I'm not exaggerating when I say it. I feel that when I read this portion of the book, it really changed my life. Because I had grown up with a certain kind of God, and reading this, I was like, I had the brain exploding experience with, everything happened for me. And I was like, I really wish I would have known about this a long time ago. I really wish that this would have been something that I learned when I was little, and I could have had that precious image with me as I moved through, stuff I've gone through. And yeah, I hope, like, if I have kids, that can be something that is taught to them, like, when they're young, so that they can just know that as they're growing up.
Yeah, to know God is with us in all different embodiments.
I particularly love that quote too. The word I want to use is, it's my gateway drug. That was the first experience, encounter I had as well with a God that didn't look white and powerful, yada, yada, yada. This idea that God could be perhaps a woman in a sit-puff wheelchair. And for me, that allowed me to go lots of places. And I'm thinking of, Swinton's reflection, where he talks about Jesus with Down syndrome, and Natalie Wigg Stevenson's recent reflection of God with Alzheimer's, that all of a sudden, all of the possibilities opened up and I could start playing. I like how Natalie Wigg Stevenson talks about, the theological imagination, and start playing with these different images of Jesus and God, and how that explodes my theology in really wonderful and creative ways. So Eastland was my gateway drug for that. And I love that quote for that reason. So I'm so glad you shared it. Thank you, Miriam.
Yeah, how we think about God, I think, shape how we think about leaders in the church, how we think about community members. And so having a very particular view of who God is damaging to people in leadership, I think. And that's why in the Bible God has so many names. God needs so many names and so many images, so that we experience the breadth of their love for people.
For those who are listening, everybody's nodding. There's a lot of nodding.
What you shared, Miriam, reminds me of a story that was really helpful to me when I was going through a divorce, and I was struggling with, I still want to be ordained, and, is there room for me in the church, and all these questions. And I had a mentor, her name was Kathy Campbell, and she used to be a priest in New Westminster, the diocese on the coast of Canada in the Anglican Church, the West Coast. And she told me a story of a colleague of hers who was trying to discern a call to ordained ministry when, I think this was in the 60s, early 70s. So apparently, because I entered the tradition too late, it was actually a debate about whether priests with visible disabilities could actually preside on account of Leviticus. For fuck's sake. Okay. Okay, like, let's just do some hermeneutics, shall we? Anyway, but here was the debate. And so here's this woman. I don't remember her name, and I don't remember if Kathy gave me her name, but a woman who lived with CP that affected her speech. And so she's up on the mic giving her testimony, and she said, you know, here was this situation where I'm struggling in the churches. Maybe I shouldn't be ordained because of Leviticus. And one day I was reading Genesis chapter 1, and I realized that I too am made in the image of God. So I decided I could become a priest, and here I am. And there was just this moment for me of, yeah, there is room for me, at least for communities of people who are willing to listen to a woman with CP say, I too am made in the image of God. So I really, yeah, that was what I was reminded of. I don't understand denying anyone who even looks broken, even if we wanted to use that language. We literally, in the Anglican tradition, fracture the bread. We literally break it in pieces and hand it to people, which to me says, brokenness, whatever we want to call that, is something that God uses. So how the hell would you deny the communion elements to someone who you think, in whatever your framework is more broken than you? Pay attention. God may, the Holy Spirit may be trying to whisper something complicated and crunchy and life-changing to you through that person. What do I know?
Yeah.
So thanks, Miriam.
That's exactly when Nancy goes in her book to say the broken body of crisis is our communion, and so should be represented in all bodies as well. It's one thing to say, I know I'm worthy to be a minister in the church, and I have been deemed worthy by the church to be ordained. It's another thing to find a place to serve in the church that's open to do that. That's where my work is wanting to go. So we will talk more about that at a later date too. But for now, I am so thankful for this conversation, for the wisdom that has shaped and continue to shape each of us. And I'm thankful to be able to share that with listeners and viewers so they might have my go and read or my go and look someone up on YouTube and find out more. So that's great, and we look forward to our next conversation with the topic to be determined. So if any of our listeners have a burning question, please reach out to Amy and I. Thank everyone